Hi, my name is Nataniel Holtzman, and I'm a PhD student at Stanford University working with Professor Alexandra Konings. Plant hydraulic traits, that is, traits that describe the movement of water through plants, are important for understanding ecosystem responses to water stress, which are projected to become even more important and severe as climate change progresses. In recent years, land surface models have begun to incorporate explicit representations of water flow in plants. However, in order to use those models to their fullest extent, we need to assign parameter values to the ecosystems in each pixel in terms of their hydraulic traits. And that's actually very difficult to do given our current knowledge of the world. Typically, we measure plant hydraulic traits in the field on the scale of individual plants. But it's difficult to upscale those measurements to the scale that's needed for ecosystem models and global Earth system models, because hydraulic traits do not necessarily correspond to what we typically think of as plant functional types, as shown in this plot from Andriek 2015. The P50, or the water potential at which 50% of xylem conductance is lost, has basically as much variation within each functional type as it does between many of the functional types. Instead of the bottom-up approach of taking data about individual plants and trying to aggregate those to ecosystem scale, what we do in this talk is we're going to look at remote sensing, where we take a top-down approach looking down from space, and this naturally comes with spatial aggregation and large spatial extents. Specifically, we're looking at passive microwave remote sensing, which is sensitive to the water content in the soil, as well as the water content in the vegetation through a parameter called vegetation optical depth. And because plant water content is monotonically related to plant water potential through a pressure volume curve, we can use the plant water content information that's contained in microwave remote sensing to learn about plant water potential, which is the key variable in hydraulics that drives water flow through plants. It's been shown that vegetation optical depth responds to changes in plant water potential at an ecosystem scale on timescales from seasonal, where we see here a dip in vegetation optical depth during the growing season as the soil moisture becomes drier, and that's reflected in the plant water potential here. We can also see these parallel responses of VOD and plant water potential on the scale of within a day. So now that we've shown that microwave remote sensing data is linked to vegetation water status, can we use that data as a constraint on plant hydraulic traits in a model? In fact, we did this last year. We took microwave remote sensing data and assimilated it into a very simple plant hydraulic model that was built just for this purpose. And what we found was that some traits are much more easily constrained than others. So as you can see on the left, the stomatal trait with the sensitivity to humidity or vapor pressure deficit is very well constrained, while on the right, a xylem trait, the whole plant capacitance, is poorly constrained. Another question that remains to be answered is that trait values are model specific to a certain extent. Saying a trait has a value of 2 in one model may not be transferable to another model. So what will this same approach even work in a more complicated land surface model that has, multiple layers of soil, a more complex vegetation structure, etc. In that study, we used observations at 2 times a day. So for example, 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. or 1 a.m. and 1 p.m. Those are the type of observations that we have currently from satellites like SMAP, because those are in sun-synchronous orbit. What that basically gives you is 2 snapshots per day, like you can see in the schematic figure at right. And in those snapshots, if you look closely, there's actually a blue curve and a black curve, but they look pretty similar if all you're seeing is those 2 snapshots. But what if instead we had data throughout the day we could observe times of day where those two diurnal cycles differed, and we could tell apart the underlying plant hydraulic traits that contributed to those differences. One way of getting such data from space would be a satellite in geostationary orbit that stays pointing at a single area of Earth, such as North America. Now, those satellites are expensive to design and launch, more so than the ones in sun-synchronous orbit. So it's not clear whether having more data would be worth it in terms of the information it would shed on plant hydraulics. So with this study, we wanted to ask the question, how much better would assimilating full diurnal observations, such as those from a geostationary orbit, constrain plant hydraulic traits and states compared to assimilating data from a sun-synchronous orbit? No, we don't actually have a geostationary satellite that does microwave remote sensing in orbit currently, so we're going to investigate this question using simulated data. The way that this simulation experiment works is that we take realistic values for plant and soil hydraulic parameters. We use them as inputs along with real meteorological data in a land surface model. And this produces time series of plant water potential and soil moisture, evapotranspiration, etc. And we take those model outputs and run them through a simple radiative transfer model to simulate microwave observations that a satellite might see. We take those synthetic observations and we add noise because a satellite doesn't see everything with perfect accuracy. And at this point, we split the experiment into several parallel paths, where each path represents a satellite in a different orbit observing at different times of day, or maybe even all times of day for a geostationary satellite. And given each set of observations at different times of day, we can assimilate those observations into a land surface model to retrieve estimates of the plant hydraulic parameters. We can compare the retrieved parameters with the original true parameters, and we can also use those retrieved parameters to run the model for several additional years of input meteorological data and see whether those retrieved parameters are able to predict the right dynamics of plant water potential and other ecosystem states and fluxes. What I'm calling orbital scenarios that we're going to test here are, for one, a full diurnal scenario, which corresponds to a geostationary orbit. The second scenario corresponds to a single satellite in sun-synchronous orbit, where we observe at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. once every 3 days. Not every day, because it takes time for the satellite to process and return to a single part of the Earth. And the third scenario is if we have 2 satellites in sun-synchronous orbit, so we have observations at 4 times a day. To briefly go over the land surface model that we're using in these experiments, it's called the CLIMA model, which is developed by the Climate Modeling Alliance. And it has non-steady state plant hydraulics, so it directly models water storage as well as water flow. It has a multi-layer vegetation canopy and soil, and eventually it will be part of a Earth system model integrated with atmosphere and ocean models. Here's a schematic showing how the model represents a vegetation canopy. So you have 3 canopy layers, each of which has a leaf and a branch. You have a trunk, and you have multiple soil layers, each of which has a root water potential and a soil water potential. With the right parameter values, CLIMA is able to accurately reproduce the dynamics of evapotranspiration at the study site that we're using for meteorological input data, which also has an eddy covariance tower. And this is the Missouri Ozarks Flux Tower site in the central United States, which is a oak hickory forest. The great thing about the Missouri Ozarks Flux Tower site is that it has a long time series of field measurements of plant leaf water potential. So we were able to calibrate the plant hydraulics of the model against those measurements too, and show that it accurately models plant hydraulics. Now, in reality, there would be many processes going on in the land surface that the model wouldn't be capturing. So to qualitatively represent this gap, we force the model to use a different stomatal conductance scheme during the parameter retrieval from the one that was used to generate the synthetic truth. Here's an example of the synthetic truth scenarios simulation of leaf water potential in black, and the leaf water potential simulated based on parameters retrieved from observing at all times of day, as shown in blue. And there's a distribution over those parameters because we're using Bayesian techniques to retrieve the parameters. That's why you see many different blue lines. So we get a spread that describes the uncertainty. Now here's the same time series, except now in orange, we're showing the retrievals based on twice daily observations. So there's a lot more uncertainty. There's a lot more spread around the true value. And I should mention that this difference in uncertainty is not due to the sheer number of observations being different, which it is, but we've controlled for that by normalizing the likelihood of each observation by the total number of observations. And here's an example of the differences in parameter estimates of plant hydraulic parameters. So here we're showing maximum xylem conductance. And I'm going to show a lot of these figures that look just like this, but for different parameters. So you can see the color-coded reference to the different orbit scenarios, and the y-axis has the true value shown as a horizontal line. It's on a log scale ranging from the minimum to the maximum of the prior distribution, which was used to sort of initialize the parameter estimation. So going into parameters related to xylem hydraulics, we can see that all three observing scenarios do quite well looking at the maximum xylem conductance and maximum xylem water storage, which is representing capacitance in this particular model. But they're quite different in terms of accuracy in xylem P63, which is the water potential at which 63% of conductance is lost, where only the one with full diurnal observations really gets this right. And you can see the same thing for this steepness of the conductivity loss curve. For the plant parameters related to stomatal functioning, one thing that we can really see is that they're estimated incorrectly relative to the true parameter, but that's actually something we should be expecting because we are forcing the model to use the wrong stomatal conductance scheme. So these parameters have to adapt to compensate. This is just a demonstration of how parameters in a model don't necessarily correspond to parameters in reality. Finally, with the parameters related to soil hydraulics, the story is similar to the xylem parameters in that only the retrievals with full diurnal observations are able to accurately capture all of these parameters. When we take the retrieved parameters and use them to run the model over many years, we can see that the parameters based on full diurnal observations accurately predict GPP compared to the true model. So the true model is shown in black. The model based on retrieved parameters is shown in blue. When we look at the same plot, but with GPP predicted from the parameters retrieved from looking only at twice daily, we see a lot more uncertainty. So we're not really able to constrain the primary productivity very well. And if we summarize the accuracy of the predicted model states and fluxes by taking the root mean squared error relative to the true model, we can see that, especially in terms of gross primary productivity, but also to a lesser extent in terms of ET, the full diurnal parameters are able to predict these model states better than the parameters resulting from either twice daily or 4 times daily observations. In conclusion, if we had a microwave remote sensing platform that provided continuous diurnal observations, we would be significantly better able to constrain ecosystem scale hydraulic parameters and states. Thank you.